Hi, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to our webinar on climate adaptation in business. I'm Roshni Bandesha, the head of ESG and sustainability at BGF. And today I'm joined by Hugo, Stephanie, and Paul, who will be speaking to us on different ways that businesses can adapt to this new world of decarbonization. The reason behind this webinar is that climate change is really top of mind given the intensity and the extent of the problem. What we hear from a lot of our portfolio companies is there is the ambition to go down this route. However, there is a lack of clarity on how to actually start and what can actually be done on a day-to-day basis or year-on-year basis. So what we thought would be useful is to hear from experts on how they are seeing climate adaptation being done in large businesses, small businesses, but also spotlight on one of our own portfolio companies, BF1, in order to see how they went through this journey. We fully recognize that each business needs to take a slightly nuanced approach when it comes to adapting their own strategies to climate change. However, there is an inherent belief as well that you can have best practices that can channel your directions and your incentives in the right way along the journey. With that, perhaps I would request all the three panelists to introduce themselves. But before that, before I forget, to all the attendees, thank you for joining us today morning. If you have any questions, please just put them in the question box and I will be able to share those with our panelists and they will be seeking to answer those towards the end of the conversation. Yes, now shifting over to our great panelists, if I could ask Hugo for you to introduce yourself and a little bit about you and the company.
Thank you, Roshni, and good morning, everybody. I'm Hugo Kimber, the founder director of Carbon Responsible. And Carbon Responsible has been providing data-driven solutions supported by expert advisory in carbon emissions since 2012. The bulk of our work is really helping companies to quantify impact and then to help them on a journey that involves target setting, reduction and ongoing management. And in doing that, we work with very large companies, medium-sized companies and small companies across a wide range of sectors.
Thank you. Steph, could I ask you to go next?
Thank you. Hello, yes, I'm Stephanie Ray, and I'm a sustainability consultant. I'm the founder of Nature Positive, which is an RSK group company. And what we do at Nature Positive is we work with organisations on their sustainable transition across a wide range of topics, helping them set strategy and really drive that sustainable transformation into everything they do.
Finally, Paul.
Yep, hi, I'm Paul Dance and I'm Production Director at BF1 Systems. So I lead the production, planning, safety, health, environment and quality teams across our manufacturing sites in Dis, Grantham and Romania. BF1 Systems are a market-leading provider of wire and harnesses, tyre pressure monitoring systems, force measurement sensors and steering wheels into race teams and high-end automotive. And our vision is to be the biggest supplier of electronics for the world's highest performing vehicles.
Thank you, Paul. Now just jumping into the conversation, and perhaps Stephanie, I would like to start with you, is if we were to think about a small business that hasn't really been thinking through the climate adaptation strategy, could you help us just set the context and share with us what is the most practical way for a business to get their head around what is climate adaptation? Is it only just looking at your GHG emissions or is it something more?
Okay, well, thanks, Roshni. No, we're very much not just talking about GHG emissions. When we're thinking about how climate change affects businesses, there are two main aspects that we consider. We've got on the one hand climate mitigation and on the other climate adaptation. So mitigation is making the impacts of climate change less severe by preventing or reducing emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So those things that we're all talking about and reducing our energy demand, switching to cleaner technology and so on in the transition to net zero. And then adaptation means the process of adjusting to the current and future effects of climate change. So basically, you're dealing with the effects or symptoms rather than the causes. Now, obviously, you don't do these things in isolation. We've got to tackle both of them as businesses. You know, if you found that your boat had sprung a leak and was starting to fill with water, then you'd probably start bailing it out, adaptation, as well as trying to find and plug the hole, mitigation. And it's the same with climate. We can't just keep developing strategies to adapt to the effects of climate change. We also need to reduce our emissions and keep the degree of effects we all suffer from global heating as low as we can. So climate adaptation is a huge issue for businesses, all businesses. We have to face the reality that even if nations keep to the Paris emissions targets that they're all signed up to, then we're going to still have significant global warming baked in, as it were. So at the moment, we're looking at an average rise in global temperature of 1.5 to 2.5 degrees. And that's what we have to think about. That's what we're adapting to. And that means that, no matter what we do with the emissions we release in the future, the emissions already released and planned mean that by 2050, London will have a climate more like Barcelona, sadly, without the beach or the architecture or the wine or the food. Manchester will be like Montevideo. Miami will be more like Rio. But most critically, there'll be over 100 cities around the world where under some climate scenarios, by 2050, their climates will be unlike anything in our current climate models. And this is places like Seoul, Beijing, Baghdad, Delhi, Washington, Montreal. In total, probably about a fifth of the global urban population will be living in places that are subject to extremes of climate events that we just haven't seen before. Extreme heat, cold, more frequent storms, more intense droughts, rising sea levels, wildfires. You get the picture. So that gives us all sorts of challenges as a society. They're political and social challenges for sure, but also physical infrastructure problems. If you applied a Spanish climate to London geology, then the expansion and contraction of the London clay under the city with those extreme heats in the summer, more rainfall, and then drying right out, you're going to expect a lot more movement, subsidence issues, and so on. That with rising sea levels, we'll have to look at more sea defences and areas where maybe we just have to give up the unequal struggle and adopt a managed retreat. So these are massive issues that go to the heart of company strategy. And they pose risks for all businesses, and they can be internal or value chain risks. So physical risks, will there be damage to your infrastructure or other assets, your factories? Will there be damage to your supply chain operation because of these increased frequency or intensity of weather events? There might be availability or price risks. Will unpredictable weather affect harvests and commodity prices? And there are product risks. Is your product still relevant in a world that's changed that much? There are risks around the external environment as well, of course. There's ratings risk. Will it be harder to get capital? Will there be higher costs of capital because of climate-related exposure? Regulatory risks or legal or policy areas, and then reputational risks, either from your company specifically or in the form of public perception of an overall industry. And we can see how attitudes are changing towards the fossil fuel industry, for example. So obviously these are huge risks, but the obverse of any of those is an opportunity. And there'll be massive business opportunities for those who get their approach to adaptation right. So that's probably a long answer to your question, but it is a really wide-ranging agenda and one that goes to the heart of all company strategies and performance.
No, that's really good, because if I could summarize, so you're talking about that at the base level, the biggest risks are you as a company are facing that the product itself becomes irrelevant because it's no longer possible to produce it or supply it to the customers no longer require it. Even if the product is required, there would be a whole supply chain effect which is outside of your control, so you're not actually able to provide it to the customers. And then on top of that comes the regulatory problems, the reputational problems as well. So that the climate adaptation requires you to think through all these places and think about different scenarios of what would happen and how would you look into it.
Exactly. It's the heart of your strategy, really. It's not some little bolt-on additional thing we might think about as well as our core strategy. It's got to become your core strategy.
Understood. Okay. So Stephanie, I think the kind of businesses that we see within the BGF portfolio, but outside, talking a little bit more about it, are generally the large emitters. But we also recognize that there are smaller emitters, not smaller emitters, but sectors such as tech, who aren't necessarily thinking about it as much or have a different view on this. Perhaps if you could spend a few minutes talking about, when you think about best practice in a large emitting industry, like a manufacturing plant, what would best practice in climate adaptation look for them? What kind of steps should they be thinking? How should the board be approaching this? Versus perhaps a tech firm how should they be thinking about their climate adaptation? And is there a difference in the way that their CEO and board takes this forward?
Okay. Yeah, I'd agree. It is top of mind for organizations who are big emitters. So they're aware of their climate impacts, and so they're also thinking about their effects and how to adapt to them. And certainly other organizations that are close to their impacts on the planet, people that harvest directly from nature, the food and beverage sector, mining, and so on, tend to be closer to this. If you want to know what good looks like, well, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, is a good place to start. So you can use all of their recommendations to help you consider what your climate-related risks are, first of all. So I would be looking for a company that's clearly thought through the different types of risks. And as you said, this really starts at the top. You need to see good board level buy-in and leadership. You know, I'd expect to hear CEOs talking about climate adaptation. It's an existential threat to their business. And, you know, as a key risk, I would expect to see business planning and assigning responsibilities accordingly. I think we'd expect board oversight of those risks and the opportunities where they arise. You might want to develop a risk register and a clear understanding of how those risks are going to be managed and when they're going to be reviewed. Those effects of climate change need to be built into how your company develops its strategy over the short, medium, and long term. And I would expect that the development of that strategy should involve engaging with key stakeholders like regulators and the organization's supply chain. You're going to have to build it into your financial planning. And really importantly, I think you've already mentioned it, Roshni, the use of scenario planning. What would the impacts of business on the business be at different levels of global temperature rise? And then we can adapt accordingly as we see how we're performing on Paris targets. When you've got that right, I'd expect to see a really detailed plan for the management of those risks and the associated metrics that you use to track how well you're doing. And then, of course, as we said earlier, adaptation is not a siloed issue. I'd expect to see it tied to a net zero strategy, ideally a zero emissions strategy, and a clear transition plan as part of the company's wider plan that assesses and promotes action on all of their environmental and social impacts. So what's key here is that targets are backed up by plausible stress-tested plans that deliver the right outcomes. You know, we don't want to see targets with no substance behind them. We want a theory of change, how you will get from where you are now to where you want to be. And yes, there can be some uncertainty in that model, but you need to know the broad steps of how you're going to do that, how you're going to adapt in different scenarios. And we see too many net zero plans that rely on as yet non-existent technology to get them down to zero. But the issues that we're dealing with are enormous, and the scale of change is transformational. It's not incremental. So we need to really see businesses doing what they do best, you know, innovating, using that entrepreneurial spirit to really make a difference and, you know, decide whether they want to be a Netflix rather than a Blockbuster Video. So it's really interesting to me that you mentioned the tech sector. At Nature Positive, we recently did a piece of research called the FTSE 100 Biodiversity Report Card, which looked at how FTSE companies were addressing their impacts on their natural environment. And tech came out as one of the lowest performing sectors, actually along with financial services. And the reason that's normally given by companies when they don't take biodiversity or wider natural environment issues into account is we did a materiality assessment and we decided it wasn't a big issue for us. And that's something that we hear about climate adaptation as well. And that sort of comment tends to come from one of two misunderstandings or cognitive biases. So firstly, people have their head in the sand about scope 3. You know, whether looking at our value chain for carbon, biodiversity or anything else, it just gets put on the too difficult pile. You know, we don't have control over that. We can't think about it, but that's where your impacts are. That's where your emissions are. That's where your adaptation risks are. They're usually either in your raw materials and supply chain, or they're in the use and disposal of your products. And companies, really large or small, need to embrace that whole value chain approach, big or small emitters. And secondly, companies don't really understand some of the sustainability issues. So for biodiversity, that's often, you know, people think about it as the green space in the car park, but biodiversity is just a fancy way of saying nature, you know, everything that life on Earth and all the goods and services it provides for us. So companies saying that doesn't affect them are really saying, you know, they don't rely on water or clean air or a survivable climate. So even if you only emit genuinely small amounts of carbon, there's still no reason to believe that adaptation is a less of an issue for you than it is for large emitters. In the same way that there's no equity at a country level, the Marshall Islands are not a large emitter of carbon, but they're going to be underwater in 50 years, even under current climate change scenarios. In the same way, even if your business doesn't have big carbon mitigations to resolve, you could have major adaptation issues. So adaptation is about where your operations are in the climate risks, your infrastructure, is it going to be resilient in different climate scenarios, your supply chain, your sensitivity to price changes in your supply or in your sales, how your customer base might act, what's the reputation of your sector like, are there going to be changes in regulation or policy, is there a risk of litigation, what are the new technologies coming on stream, how much do you rely on water, what access have you got to new markets, and so on. It's really nothing to do with how much you emit. So the process for a company that considers itself to be a small emitter is exactly the same. Understand your vulnerabilities, make a risk assessment, use scenarios, and start putting actions in place as soon as you can.
Thank you, Steph. That was very useful to understand. Now, Hugo, if I could turn to you and thinking about sort of, carbon responsible works with both large and small companies. And we've often discussed that it's a lot of companies are still at the beginning of their journey. And the beginning always seems to be from a point of view of data, which you also speak about quite a lot. Could you maybe, for the benefit of the audience, just very quickly at a high level, help us understand what is emission measurement or data measurement when it comes to climate adaptation? And maybe we could take the same example of maybe what these scopes 1, 2, 3 would look like for a manufacturer versus a tech business.
Certainly. So as I think Stephanie has covered, there's quite a broad range already in terms of the emissions that may be there, and people who are starting may feel that they have quite a small impact, and therefore that is retarded action in the first instance. We're doing quite a lot of technology companies at the moment who, again, on a scope 1 and 2 basis, probably not emitting a huge amount, but the scope 3 impacts become really quite considerable. And we're really only at the early stages of companies being fully engaged with scope 3, which is very broad. So when we're looking at the challenge initially, what we're trying to do is, Stephanie's right, you need to have a framework. You need to understand what this means to your business and where you're going with it. For us, that all anchors back to the numbers. And these 3 scopes, which just to briefly run through those. Scope 1 is the fuel that you're combusting in your own premises, machinery, vehicles. Scope 2 is your electricity, occasionally heat and steam, if that's what you have. That's more common potentially on the continent. Scope 3 is your indirect emissions, and that is pretty much everything. So that can be both downstream and upstream impacts, including sold products, leases, for example, or leased equipment that you may have. So understanding what that landscape is absolutely the start point, because from there, although emissions are not the only part of the overall picture, you're able to start to look at what those numbers are, what they mean, what your data capability is, because we find initial measurement for any company, large or small, is always deeply painful. And it's not possible to get all of that information in the first instance. But those numbers will start to give you a sense of profile. And that profile will then help to support target setting and reduction pathways. And those are driven very much by the type of emissions that you're looking at. So with somebody who may be providing huge services into house building, for example, we would see a lot of white and red diesel usage. There are ways in which you can reduce that, for example, through fuel additives. But right now, the alternatives to large combustion engine vehicles is not there. Where you look at that, and I'll come on to this in a minute, around other examples of people who are in service, they have opportunities to actually implement more robust pathways quicker. So we'll have some clients who I think will be actually carbon zero by 2030, and others who, in fairness, will struggle to even get to net zero by 2050, and that's driven by their profile. So everything we do with the company is designed to understand where they are and what this means to them in terms of what they can actually do. And when we're talking about tech, it's quite interesting. There's a lot of technology companies are saying, well, we don't really have a very big, we don't emit very much. Well, they don't, but they, for example, use a huge amount of cloud services. They're using a lot of other services within their scope 3 that are very impactful. And some recent research suggested that by the middle of this decade, our global tech emissions, as it were, and everything related to tech, will be larger than aviation by 2025. And we always talk about aviation a lot because it's a big and obvious emitter. So there is a big impact there, and it's trying to unpick it, which is what we're trying to help people do at the beginning of that journey, and then to chart a coherent pathway forward to net zero, which Stephanie rightly pointed out, has plans and milestones in it, rather than it just being a claim that somebody makes. And that is a part and parcel of the whole climate adaptation piece. And certainly, emissions are not the only part, but they are a very live part. And also one which is a cost to businesses. So again, Stephanie touched on, what some of these risks coming up are. At the moment, we're seeing, costs of upwards of £700 a tonne to create 1 tonne of carbon dioxide emissions equivalent from electricity, for example. Diesel and petrol not very far behind at this point. There is then potentially a forward tax risk, which is hovering around $50 a tonne as an output cost of carbon. So there are lots of things to consider in that whole TCFD matrix about what your costs are, what your risks are, and then how you're going to deal with that in terms of where your business is going.
Thank you, Hugo. I think then delving a little bit deeper into an example, perhaps, I think we previously spoke about the work that you've done with 2 different types of businesses. I think one was a car sales one and the other was a gym. But could you maybe pick one of them and walk us through how these particular businesses went through their own journey of doing all the way from emission calculation to actually having some kind of climate adaptation strategy, which they have implemented to some extent?
Yes, so I might fuse the 2 examples together, but you're right. One is a very large gym business. The other is a very large seller and reconditioner of cars. Both have started their work over the course of the last 12 months, having done nothing in this area previously. So as we touched on, the data capture piece was relatively painful and still improving in fairness, and will continue to improve and also expand as they go along. But if you take a look at cars, for example, where on the threshold of banning combustion engines, and therefore that would look like quite a big risk and a lot of adaptation that's going to be required in a business that is industrially selling vehicles. But what they had asked us to help them do was to understand how they could make an impact. And that was everything from how they could work with consumers to reduce impact, as well as reduce their own impact from operations, and start to look forward to what the electric vehicle revolution is going to look like and what part they might play in that. And their approach to this has been, for example, they're just literally commencing a large solar program within their own business. And they obviously are starting to charge a lot of electric vehicles. They use a lot of electricity. And this approach, again, in both of these 2 largest companies, has been driven from the top. So there is, whilst it may have started with a compliance requirement, it has been very much seized upon and embraced by directors and indeed CEOs to drive this forward. So we're charting a gradual path, which will take them a number of years, but is an exciting one because they will be providing benefit to the climate, providing benefit to their consumers, de-risking their operations commercially in relation to policy and climate change, and putting them potentially in a very strong position by 2030, which would also, I suspect, be one of those areas where you look at it and go, right, well, this company has almost beacon status in the area that it's in because of the work that it's doing right across the board. And when we're dealing with emissions, we're looking at every type of emissions. That includes things like waste. It includes water. Water may be relatively low emissions for a lot of people, but it's still an important sustainability indicator. We have a lot of issues with water. So it's trying to be able to look at how you can bring all of those things together in a way that critically is going to be climate beneficial, but also is commercially sensible and is going to be commercially beneficial as well.
Thank you, Hugo. So I think it's for this company, you can see that the example is that they're actually working through these things, but at the same time, there's a huge problem of greenwashing, which has come up. And maybe this is both to you, Hugo and Steph, is, what we've seen is there are a lot of net zero claims, which companies have come up with. But at the same time, we also saw that UK's Competition and Markets Authority essentially went ahead and said that more than 40% of these claims are misleading or greenwashing. So well-intentioned businesses that we have perhaps in the BGF portfolio as well, how can these businesses avoid falling into these greenwashing claims around net zero? Maybe Hugo, starting with you and then over to you, Steph.
So I think that you're right to say that when you talk about things being well-intentioned, a lot of people are making net zero claims. They are making claims around their products and services, and they're doing that very often without any numbers to support it. And really what the CMA are driving at is that if you can't give your consumers enough information to make an informed choice backed by some sensible numbers and plans, then you are effectively greenwashing. And it is a confusing landscape. There's no question about that. So we did some work recently for BSI in the lead up to COP26. And one of the things we had to do was to review all of the frameworks that the UN currently have for net zero. There were 23 different definitions around what net zero actually meant. A lot of those, that sit around things like, do you use offsets or don't you use offsets? We don't, and we try and encourage clients to focus more on reduction, but it gives you a sense of how confused that landscape is. What the CMA have done is to very helpfully reduce this to what they think are the 6 things that you need to do, which provide an acid test as to where you are. It's fair to say that if you're unsure, or you're making claims about how the climate is important to you or mitigating any of the impacts, and you don't have any numbers to support it, don't. It's better to say nothing at this point than it is to say something that is unsupported by any evidence, because that will leave you open to a degree of business risk, particularly if the CMA follows through on their effective promise to start prosecuting from January.
I'm not sure if I've got anything to add to that, Hugo. I think that was a very comprehensive response. Absolutely. Go back to the data, go back across the whole scope, really make sure you understand it and take advice. And the most important piece of advice is that if you're not absolutely sure, don't make a claim at all. And I think we are seeing bigger companies doing that, because I work with a lot of larger organizations and FTSE companies who are doing some great things behind the scenes that they're just not talking about yet, because people are alive to these accusations of greenwashing, and they want to make sure they really have got their houses completely in order.
So essentially, 2 key elements that I hear is, first of all, making sure that you understand what you're speaking about, both from what is your end ambition, so what is net zero that you are defining as, is it emission reduction, and the second is the coverage of it. You shouldn't just go out and make a claim if you've only looked at scope 1 or scope 2. You have to give a reasonable idea about why it doesn't include scope 3, for example. That's clear. Yeah. Thank you. Now, Paul, jumping into BF1. So I think BF1 has been on a very exciting journey for the last, 2 years or so, where you guys have really yourself internally driven the concept of climate adaptation. And I think that's useful for the attendees to also hear about where you are currently in the journey, but essentially how did it even start? What is climate adaptation for you all? How do you think about it? And the scaling up that has happened. It would be great to hear a little bit about the motivations, who's been supported, and how you're structuring this within your business.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that within the industry we operate, there's a lot of skepticism around environmental credentials. Obviously, we make parts that go on really fast cars. So at the top level of business, we were fully aware of this. And as a supplier, we wanted to demonstrate that we can start to break this down. So we sort of listened to the voice of our employees through employee engagement surveys and our employee engagement committee. And from talking to them, it was obviously clear that they were interested in what our environmental credentials were and what we could do. And obviously, as things move forward, it's also become clear that it's important to our customers too. So I think there was a real appetite for becoming a carbon net zero business. So back in 2019, we pulled together a team of key stakeholders from across the business, from production, purchasing, finance, dispatch, and we worked alongside an external specialist called Delta Simons to agree what we needed to do to move forwards. So as I said, we started this in 2019, so early to mid 2019, we started on the journey, and by mid 2020, we had been certified as a carbon net zero business. And through 2021, we've moved that further forward, and we are now a beyond net zero business, meaning we now offset the equivalent of 50% more carbon emissions than as a group we actually produce. And through the offset of our residual emissions, we're supporting gold standard sustainable development projects. The two that we currently support are water filtration and cook stoves in Guatemala and household biogas in Vietnam. And again, to allow even more engagement across the whole of our business in our journey, we held a group-wide poll to allow the whole team to vote on what projects we should support. And in terms of that process, we are looking at emissions all the way through Scope 1 into Scope 3. So our carbon footprint includes scope emissions from 1 to 3.
Thank you. So it was obviously clear that the voice of the employees was really critical, and that sort of put an upward pressure onto the board. And then you also heard from your client side. But again, I mean, when you would have put this team together, there would have been so many things that you could have started with the adaptation, right? So you had to pick and choose. So could you maybe walk us through how you identified the key areas which you thought was relevant for your specific business as a part supplier, and what these 4 or 5 areas were for the climate adaptation strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, that's where Delta Simons came into their own in terms of an external resource. So the various stakeholders within BF1 provided them with our annual data on things such as energy consumption, waste disposal, travel, and material usage. And we've done that in all sorts of formats. It was good that they take the information off of us however we had it, and they then done the work. And like I say, they done the technical bit of collating all that data and providing us with a carbon footprint report. And as I say, that covered Scope 1 through to Scope 3 emissions. And this highlighted to us that our top 4 contributors to CO2 emissions were energy consumption, material usage, business travel, and waste disposal. The far highest of that was our purchase of electricity at 120 tonnes of CO2 emissions annually. And early on, we'd realised that electricity was going to be our lowest hanging fruit, should we say, from a production term. We always go after what we can improve quickest. So the team put together a business case to install solar panels at our site in Diss, which is our biggest consumer of electricity across our group.
Thank you. And when it came to the other parts of it, so your actual, the parts that you were producing, you also said that you had done some work on making the parts more sustainable. What was that journey like? Yeah,
absolutely. So again, that was sort of in conjunction with one of our key customers. There was questions put into the business around the product that we provide for them. So it was one of our steering wheels, which are made of carbon fibre. So we looked into the potential of using a more sustainable fibre to build. It doesn't completely remove the need for any carbon fibre, because carbon fibre gives it the product its structural strength. But we've been able to reduce the amount of carbon fibre in the product by nearly 75%, and we use a fibre which is comes from a sustainable source.
All right. And how did the customers, what has their reaction been to this change?
Well, I'll come to that. I'll come on to that in a bit. But yeah, it's been a success because they've ordered more above and beyond what we'd forecasted. And they've actually asked us to rework some of their earlier model steering wheels to go to the more sustainable version as well. So it's been really, really positive.
Okay, well, that's great. I think climate adaptation, as you said, like the energy part of it and all these pieces, they might seem a bit farther away from what is the core strategy. But I'm sure that for BF1, there's actually been a financial return of investing in all these different parts. So there's been a business case for why you went through the climate adaptation. Is there any data or evidence that you could share with us that shows the success of the strategy for the business in a bigger way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think before moving on to finances, I'd prefer to look at the non-financial benefits. So if we focus on the environmental benefit first, in year 1, we reduced our carbon emissions by over 50%. And we will, recognising that 2020 is clearly not a normal year of operation with everything that's going on in the world. So we will still use 2019 as our sort of start point in terms of like-for-like years. And in the 15 months that our solar panels have been operational, they've provided an accumulative reduction of 110 tonnes of carbon, which is the equivalent of planting 300 trees, which we're all quite pleased with. Also, the moral benefits, when running our employee engagement survey earlier in 2021, we received very high scores with regard to the statement, BF1 are socially responsible and care for our environment. So the feedback coming from our employees is really, really positive. And then really moving on to the financial side, as I said, we've received Highland forecasted orders for our steering wheel that is manufactured using sustainable fibres. And for those people who really like the numbers, the financial benefits solely from our solar panel installation, well, the install was cost neutral from day one because of the way we financed it. By year 4, we'll be saving around £20,000 annually. So over the 20-year lifespan of our PV system, this will bring in savings in the region of £340,000.
Oh, wow, that's really good to hear. And Paul, like, I think one question that we hear is like, who should be playing this role? But within BF1, it was sort of you along with a group of other people. Is there a right sort of fit of individuals who need to come together to pull together climate adaptation strategies? How was that experience for you for BF1?
Well, I think that the key for us was to make, well, more or less everything we do around safety, health, environment and quality, we try and make it owned by everybody, because everybody within the business has got a part to play in all of them things. So right at the beginning, it was around getting the right stakeholders in the room, along with Delta Simons at the very beginning, to first of all, really, it was about Delta Simons explaining to us what it all really meant. They went into a lot of detail about the scope 1 to 3 emissions. We were really passionate in making sure that we included a good proportion of scope 3 emissions within what we were trying to achieve, especially around the materials reduction, because we knew that, obviously there's technology around that could reduce the amount of carbon fibre we were using. So I think the key there was getting everybody brought into it all across the business, and then the senior leadership team really embracing it, and the key members of the senior leadership team alongside their teams really trying to drive the improvement through. But we as a business, we always try to involve everyone to try and get, if people can buy into it, they'll take ownership of it, and then we believe that if they take ownership of it, they'll live it, and then they'll deliver it.
Thank you, Paul. I know that your journey at BF1 is still going on, so there's still more climate adaptation to be done. So what do you see happening in 2022 and beyond, specifically from climate adaptation, and what is the end outcome over there?
Okay, so obviously to retain our Beyond Net Zero certification, we cannot merely offset our residual emissions on an annual basis. We have to identify and deliver projects that will allow for a year-on-year reduction of emissions produced, and we're really passionate about doing that as well. We know there's different ways that you can become a net zero business, and offsetting is one of them, but we don't want to just continually rely on offsetting more and more. We want to reduce the emissions that we're obviously producing. So as a business with a very clear growth strategy, not only organically, but through acquisition, our improvement is monitored using 3 clear carbon intensity ratio key performance indicators. And they are kilograms per square feet of operational floor area, tonnes per employee, and tonnes per £1 million of revenue. So this means that we can still grow, but we'll have quantitative targets in place to monitor our annual carbon reduction against. Because clearly, as we grow as a business, there's potential that the amount will go up, but by monitoring the KPIs, we can see what that looks like as we go through our journey. So a real life example of what that means to us is with our current development of a new production facility over in Romania. So during the design and subsequent build process, we'll be aiming to make that building as energy efficient as reasonably practicable from day one. So at the moment, we're currently in the process of developing the business case to install electric heat pumps and underfloor heating, as opposed to the standard gas heating systems that would normally be installed in most new builds in Romania at this time.
Oh, really interesting. So it's going to be a part of your growth strategy from an acquisition, but also development perspective and product piece as well, I would assume, your products.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because our certification is for the whole of our group. So as we bring new businesses into our group, we will want to grow the scope of our certification and include all of them businesses. But, we won't say, well, that business over there are really difficult, so we won't include them in our certification. We will work with them to, first of all, we'll understand as we grow what their what their current situation is, and then we'll go through exactly the same process again to identify the areas that we can offer the most benefit.
Got it. There's a question that came through from the audience for you, Paul, which was around the external sort of pressures that Stephanie and Hugo sort of talked about. So has this been driven through regulatory pressures or financial reporting pressures? How have you, or do you believe that because you're already on the journey, you've sort of mitigated that to some extent for your industry?
Yeah, absolutely. At the moment, we've not really seen any regulatory issues. We've not had anyone come in and say, we must do this. I think it's more for us. It's about the, as I said, as a business, we provide electronics into the the fastest cars in the world. So unfortunately, some of them are now going into electric cars rather than all into combustion engine cars. But clearly that industry hasn't got the best reputation when it comes to their environmental impact and their carbon footprint. What we are seeing is that our customers are starting to recognise that more and more. So when we talk to them, it's starting to definitely become important for them, and that may be being driven more by regulation, because we obviously provide into some of the biggest businesses, automotive businesses, certainly in Europe. So they will be feeding some of that. But from our point of view, it's been more driven by morally we think it's the right thing to do, and we want to do it. We believe that our employees want us to do it, which is the feedback we're getting, and we know that from the communication we're having our customers that it's becoming important for them as well. So that's really the main drivers for us at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. That was a really interesting discussion on your particular journey. Maybe if I could go to Steph now. There's a question that has come through in terms of sort of just understanding that across different businesses, just like Paul talked through the different areas that have been identified and the financial benefit of this, how long should a business keep realistically in terms of seeing the end outcomes come through? What is the patience required in this journey, essentially? And then how would you think about measuring success of climate adaptation? Because it's quite hard. There are financial elements, but also like moral elements, the different elements Paul spoke about.
There's a lot of question there. So yeah, I think what's helpful to do is to start wide and shallow. Don't be overwhelmed by the scale of the task. Look at your whole value chain and look at the sorts of risks that we've been talking about, and then identify the hotspots, the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, and then you can try to prioritize both the long-term strategies for some of the more difficult transition issues and also some of the quick and cheap wins, the low-hanging fruit, if you like. So you do get some victories on the way that you can actually see. So if your issues are around the stability or fragility of your supply chain, then you can start in a small way of exploring, can I start to use supply from this region rather than that region? In a small way, testing it out, seeing how it works. You don't have to shift your entire supply chain in one go. So I think that would be my approach, looking for those small wins, looking for testing out the longer term strategies.
Thank you, Steph. Hugo, there's a question for you, which has come through. It's basically asking that, will we make a bigger carbon reduction impact by investing in a gold standard offset project that ensures additionality, or by switching to a green tariff electricity in the UK? So which is a bigger impact, essentially?
Okay, so that's quite a big question as well. So starting with the gold standard and offset use in general, Paul has given us a really good example of how you most effectively and appropriately apply offsets around residual emissions, but putting reduction first. The difficulty with the offset market as a whole, the gold standard is an excellent standard, but it has very limited supply. The demand for offsets far outstrips what the gold standard can supply in a given year. Worst case research suggests that 8 out of 10 of these projects don't deliver fully on what they're supposed to do, producing a degree of corporate risk along the way. So it's one of those areas where I think you can't say that everything is perfect. You need to identify the scheme that you're going to run. What we try and look for when clients are doing this is also to try and see that there is as much demonstrable community benefit in the programs, and that they actually feed into other sustainable development goals beyond purely carbon. I think that's the best approach to take. On the green tariffs, we recently did an entire analysis of UK green tariffs, which doesn't make great reading, because the vast majority of these actually are not doing anything in terms of additionality, in terms of providing a greater benefit to the consumer of that electricity. So we have a lot of clients who believe that because they bought a green tariff, their carbon from their electricity is effectively zero rated, which under SECR and GHG protocol accounting standards, it is not. A lot of the renewable electricity in the UK grid is based, is already baked into the emissions values that we're seeing year on year. And additionally, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of tariffs that are backed by certificates, which can be bought and sold for less than £1. They're not actually creating more renewable energy. It's just a way of trading that. So I've tried to answer that as quickly as I can, because it's, I think the paper ran to 4 or 5 pages, but that's the brief overview. Rather than trying to spend a premium on renewable energy tariffs, possibly better reinvesting that extra premium in doing what Paul and his team have been doing, which is finding ways in which you can actually reduce and you can make a meaningful impact. There are no easy routes to the end game, and certainly the offset first approach is one that is increasingly becoming less accepted and certainly not best practice.
Thank you, Hugo. Paul, there's a question for you about the BF1 journey, which was around sort of the challenges of it. I think it seems like there was a lot of motivation, but I'm sure there were challenges around it. Like, could you speak a little bit about what were these challenges for BF1? Was it the initial getting it started? Was it agreeing which areas to focus on, or it could be data even? But if you spotlight a few challenges for us,
no problem. I think I've spoken about the voice of our employees and the voice around the business. Clearly, there's a lot of positivity there as well, but there's always going to be some skepticism as well. So first of all, it was important to us to try and break down some of that skepticism. And again, while one of the first points of our relationship with Delta Simons is that we actually got them on site for half a day, and the key stakeholders within the business, including people from the sort of employee engagement committee, we got them involved in understanding what it all meant. And then that information started to feed down. Even with the help of the external resource, there's always going to be some, especially in year one when you're trying to work out what you need to provide. There's going to be some additional work to be done for some people within the business, and including myself. So you have to be willing to accept that and do it. But what I would say is year one was harder, but year two, because you knew what was coming from year one, through the year you're already thinking to yourself, we need that information to pass on. So when it comes to you collect it as you go through the year, rather than thinking, oh, actually I've got to wait now and give them 12 months of data all in one go. So that part of it becomes easier. So I would say that they were probably the two main challenges. There's not a huge amount of people that I know that are going to easily accept the fact that I'm about to go and give them some extra work. So having that conversation and making them understand the value was really, really important.
So getting the employees to go along with you in the journey, and then actually taking a slow step-by-step approach, what Stephanie was saying, picking up different areas and working on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and also making sure that the good thing was, because we had the external support. If we had any questions, we could, and we weren't sure we had someone who could help us as well, which was a real benefit, rather than thinking that we had to, do it all alone. We had support who had been through this process many, many times and could give us the advice we needed to point us in the right direction.
Thank you, Paul. Stephanie, now a question for you from me. We've heard from Paul about a live example. Hugo's also told us about a live example. Could you share from your repertoire of clients you worked with another live example of how a company has been through this climate adaptation strategy, one that you were really impressed by or thought that they were quite thoughtful about it, the way that they went about this approach? So you're on mute.
There's always a mute at some point in one of these webinars, isn't there? Okay, we have a company that we're working with at the moment who's a major construction firm. And so their impacts are quite interesting because they don't really own assets. They're involved in building them. They don't really have control over the design and so forth. And so their role sitting in the middle has been quite an interesting one between clients and users. And the elements that they have control over is really quite difficult. And what they've been doing is having a look at, trying to extend their reach and influence up through their clients down to the users of buildings that they actually constructing for different climate scenarios. So being able to work with the client to adapt designs for buildings to make sure that they are more client resilient, building that in, even where they don't have control over it, making suggestions to their clients about how they could change things. So it's getting that approach to climate adaptation being built through everything you do. So how you tender for a job, how you interact with the client when you're delivering a project, the options that you put on the table, even where it's not something that's within your direct control, everything you do is around about pushing out these ideas to your wider value chain and trying to deliver as much benefit as you can. So I've been impressed with really, I guess, how they've taken it and internalized it, and it's become just part of business as usual.
Thank you. You mentioned scenario planning, and I think we spoke about it earlier as well. The benefit of the audience, could you help us understand what this scenario problem looks like? Are you talking about specific risks like, heat, precipitation, drought, etc., but also regulatory? How should a company construct what different scenarios are, or does that data already exist out there?
There are different climate models that you can use. So what I would use is I would set a scenario of different degrees of temperature rise. I think that those are the best scenarios to work with. If we stick to, if we keep 1.5 alive and we stick to the Paris targets, what will the world look like by 2050? If we don't achieve that and it's looking like 2.5, what will it look like? And those models are available, so you can see the impacts it would have. And I talked earlier around some of the cities in particular, where we'll see quite different elements. So you can look at models of sea level rise, and you can see, how that might affect your supply chain. You can look at how extreme heat might affect your own factory, and then you can build in, well, what should we be doing about that, and so on. So it's really map out what your value chain looks like, and then overlay what are going to be the impacts from various scenarios of climate increase.
Thank you, sir. Hugo, just asking you to also comment on the scenario planning side, perhaps an example of how you've helped clients or how you would recommend companies think through scenario planning and apply it.
So yes, firstly, as I said earlier, it starts with what you can do. So if we take short-term emissions targets, 50% by 2030 is a common trajectory that people are seeking to be on in support of Paris and global agreements. But as I said earlier, the emissions profile will dictate where you're actually going to go. You can look at the scenarios, which you should do, as Stephanie said, but then alongside that is what can you practically bring to that trajectory over a set period of time. So what we will do is to look at, first of all, what are the options to reduce emissions from all scopes. And we must re-emphasize, I think, that the scope 3 piece is very broad and still very underreported by the vast majority of companies. There is some scope 3, but it's still advancing. So what that will give you is what are the options that will get you to a net zero target? When are those likely to also come in? So I mentioned construction earlier on. We're seeing some equipment starting to come in, electrical and hydrogen equipment. Some of that's quite far off. Carbon capture is coming in, but again, with some distance off that as a proven and widespread technology. So we'll look at those available near-term things that will provide inflection points in that reduction pathway. And that is providing the best route, if you like. You've also got to look at what are you selling What is the consumer feeling about that? What can you practically do? Stephanie mentioned production, for example. What is there a real climate risk to your facilities to demand? What is the existing regulatory environment, which is expanding rapidly, both in terms of reporting and disclosure and taxation? And what is that as a cost? Also, what is your rising cost going to be? I mentioned energy input costs of carbon. That's something, again, you'd want to look at because, leaving aside the vast increase in cost of electricity across Europe, there's also a security issue as well in terms of being able to get the energy you need as we move through a transition away from fossil fuels, which is already starting to have an impact in terms of pricing and availability. So all of these elements we will look at, they will all be specific to each business. They will all have a different pathway. They will all have a different timing that will affect how they use those scenarios and how they use the available data to be able to plot a way forward that they can articulate to stakeholders and investors, but at the same time, how they can then, to Paul's example, engage actively with employees and the wider team, not just the senior leadership team and a handful of people who are charged with getting the data and this being bolt-on activity. It's bringing everybody together on that journey.
Thank you, Hugo. And I think with that, we only have a couple of minutes left. So I think my last question to all the panelists is essentially, what is your call to action to all the companies and the attendees of BGF portfolio who are starting their climate adaptation journey? Maybe Paul, I can start with you. What would your call to action or advice be?
Okay, so I think first of all, I'd say I don't think that going through this process needs to come at a huge cost to your business in terms of money or time. Through our experience, the initial costs can be significantly outweighed by savings, and if you don't have expertise in your business, there's external resource out there that can certainly help. Secondly, by engaging with your employees, they will embrace the process and probably come up with some of the best ideas in terms of carbon reduction. And finally, I think it's a case of don't think that your own environmental impact is so small that by making positive changes, you will not be able to make a real difference to the big picture. If every single business in the BGF portfolio were to do their little bit, imagine the size of change that could lead to.
Thank you, Paul. Steph, your call to action?
I would put my vote for take a step back and think. Do that piece of looking at your whole value chain, looking at your whole impacts that you own as an organization, and think long term. Humans have got an inbuilt bias to think about risks and rewards in the short term preference to the long term. Obviously that's for sound evolutionary reasons. If you're running away from a tiger, it's better to run away from a tiger rather than just weigh up whether to run away or to conserve your energy in case a hungrier tiger comes along. But short-term thinking, the life of a parliament, the tenure of a CEO, is quite frankly what's got us into this situation. Short-termism gave us climate change, biodiversity loss, underfunded pensions, new fossil fuel exploration. What we need now is long-term strategic thinking.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Hugo, your call to action?
So mine would be very similar, but it's quantify and analyze what your impact and risks are, and start by measuring impact, so you have some reasonable metrics around which you can actually start a journey to reduction and mitigation and adaptation. That would be my advice.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Stephanie. I think that was a very interesting conversation. There's a lot for companies to think through, but this conversation gives me hope that it's possible if you are looking at the whole breadth, but also starting small and with the belief that actually your outputs or your results are going to outweigh your costs, both in terms of financial, but also the other non-financial benefits that it's going to bring. We will be distilling your insights into a paper and sharing it with the wider portfolio. So thank you for sharing those with us. And to the attendees, I just wanted to say that we still have one more webinar left, which is coming up this Friday. That webinar is going to take this conversation forward and specifically focus on supply chains, which are a huge part of the Scope 3 problem, as all the panelists spoke about. So I hope that you can also join us on Friday for that. But with this, I just wanted to again thank the panelists for their time and the attendees for joining us today. Have a good day, all of you.